This is going to be our first presentation regarding what I call the modern presidents. And that starts with George H. Walker Bush, followed by Clinton, and then George W. Bush, and finally Barack Obama. So today I want to talk about H.W. Bush and President Clinton. H.W. Bush was born in Maine, and he served during World War II, was a pilot, decorated pilot, and so we had a bona fide World War II hero. When we look at his political resume, he was a member of the House of Representatives. He served as the ambassador to the United Nations under President Nixon. He served as the head of the CIA for nearly a year leading into President Carter's administration. And he ran against Reagan in the 1980 primary. Now, he is going to lose that, but Reagan is going to tap him to become his vice president. And he will serve as vice president throughout the Reagan administration. And then he'll once again run for president in 1988. Now, when he runs for president, it's very clear that he's running on Reagan's coattails. And he does quite well. But what's really going to do him in is during his campaign, he's going to make the statement, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And as soon as you promise something like that, it's going to come back and bite you. When we look at the election of 1988, George Bush is going to run against Michael Dukakis. Now, like I said earlier, he was running on Reagan's coattails. In fact, he was going to continue Reagan's agenda as it was created. However, what we're going to find out about George Bush is he was not as conservative as Ronald Reagan. When we talked about the Reagan presidency, we looked at this idea of neoconservatism and this new right. Well, George Bush didn't follow completely that idea. He was more towards the middle as far as conservatives went. Now, Dukakis was running on this idea of a larger government, getting more in government involvement, getting more programs going, social programs and stuff like that. And I think that's going to hurt him a little bit in this election. What's really going to hurt the guy is when he takes this picture. He's posing in, I believe, an armored personnel carrier, as dressed up as a soldier and stuff. Now, he never served in the military. And you compare that to George Bush, who had served as a pilot during World War II, and the optics are just very bad for Dukakis. It's kind of like, who do you want for president? Do you want a real war hero or a pretender? And so that's going to hurt him in the general election. Bush is going to win quite easily, as you can see by this map, and he'll take over as the 41st president of the United States. The first year of Bush's presidency, 1989, is going to have a lot of things happening. First of all, the Soviets are going to leave Afghanistan. We're going to see the end of the Soviet Union start during this time period. And one of their first moves is to pull out of Afghanistan. Like we've talked about before, Afghanistan was the Soviet Union's Vietnam. They weren't ever able to gain a stronghold there, and so basically they're just abandoning their attempt to overtake or to move communism into that area. Environmentally, we had a major disaster up in Alaska in Prince William Sound. The Exxon Valdez is going to run aground and it's going to spill 10.8 million gallons of oil into the sound. And what we're going to see is a lot of horrible pictures of animals and other wildlife and plant life just absolutely destroyed by this disaster. And Bush is going to have to deal with this. And some people are going to criticize the way it was dealt with. One of our first terrorist attacks is going to occur during the first year of Bush's presidency, and that's going to be the Lockerbie bombing, the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103. A passenger carried a bomb on board, detonated it during flight, and the plane crashed, killing everyone on board in Lockerbie, Scotland. Like I said, this is one of the first terrorist attacks that we're seeing, and so this is obviously the first of many to come. In China, you have the student movement to bring democracy into that country. And this famous picture was taken of a student, I believe, holding a grocery bag, standing in front of this column of tanks, coming into Tiananmen Square to break up the protests. We still don't, as far as I know, we still don't know who that person was. But what we do know is that as a result of this protest, this movement for democracy in China, that hundreds of people are going to be executed. You have thousands of people being thrown in jail, and then also another thousands more just being banned or banished from the country. Now, the United States, following President Nixon's administration, has had a better relationship with China. And we were selling them goods and doing some trade with them and everything. And based on what happened in Tiananmen Square and the fallout from that, the United States and President Bush, we're going to respond. We're going to stop all military sales to China, and we're also going to ban travel to that country. Probably the biggest event that happened during 1989 in the Bush administration is going to be the tearing down or the falling of the Berlin Wall. That's going to happen, and it's going to be, it's covered on the news, and you saw people would just show up at the wall with their hand tools or whatever they could, and symbolically just start breaking it down. And it was a sight to see. I mean, people, families coming together, people from both East and West Germany standing up on top of that wall and being able to pass back and forth. So that was a huge moment. A lot of this, though, goes back to Reagan and the relationship he had with Gorbachev, as well as Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul II. They all worked during the 80s towards this point, but it came to fruition during Bush's presidency. When we look at pop culture of the 80s, you can look at the different things that came out. Pac-Man and the video games first came out in the 1980s. The Chia Pet, the Rubik's Cube, the Valley Girl, all that was part of the 80s. TV shows. The Cosby Show came out in the 1980s. It was probably the top show during that time period, but we also saw the A-Team and Married with Children and other favorites. Movies during this time, obviously with Star Wars coming out in the 1970s, the science fiction realm is going to grow quite a bit, and we'll see movies like E.T. come out, and then we'll also see the follow-ups or the sequels to Star Wars, where we see Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi during the 1980s, and then Raiders of the Lost Ark, that franchise is going to get started as well. Music during this time, Michael Jackson ruled. Thriller was the top album, but you also had great works by Prince and with Purple Rain, and Madonna became popular during the 80s, and Bruce Springsteen towards the end of the 80s, he made his mark on music as well. Probably one of the biggest events, the biggest challenges that Bush had during his presidency is going to happen over in the Persian Gulf in 1991. We had a crisis in a time period when Saddam Hussein, who was a dictator in Iraq, invaded Kuwait. His goal was to control this oil-rich country. Now, if you remember correctly, Kuwait was one of the original OPEC members. And a lot of people believe that Hussein going into Kuwait, he was using that almost as a trial or a stepping stone with a plan to move also into Saudi Arabia. The United Nations, with the United States at the lead, is going to basically condemn Hussein for going into this country, that it was an unwarranted attack, an unwarranted occupation, and the UN is going to form a coalition of a lot of countries who are going to, basically rise up and to defend Kuwait and help to liberate Kuwait from Hussein. Now, the United Nations is going to set a deadline for Iraq, saying if you withdraw by this date, everything's good. And of course, Iraq is going to refuse, and this is going to lead to the Persian Gulf War. Now, this is Saddam Hussein. He was the leader of Iraq during this time. Obviously, our leader was President George H.W. Bush. Then this is the first Persian Gulf War. General Colin Powell was the leader of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was our man on the ground here, and we heard a lot of reports from him regarding, the movement of troops and what was going on. And then our man in the field was Norman Schwarzkopf. He was the commander of troops in the Persian Gulf. January 16th, 1991, what happened was Operation Desert Storm officially started, and the way it started was with a 6-week barrage of airstrikes on Iraqi troops in Kuwait and in Iraq. Now, after 6 weeks, that's when we're finally going to send the ground troops in. Ground troops are going to hit the ground, and they are going to be there for 100 hours. Just 100 hours. So that's just 4 days and 4 hours. Until at that point, Iraq accepts the ceasefire, they withdraw from Kuwait, and Kuwait's liberated. So it was kind of almost anticlimactic, if you will, because there wasn't much to what it didn't build up to as big as a lot of people thought it was. It was 4 days of fighting. The effects, though, are going to have a much longer lasting touch on world politics and U.S. politics. Winning this war should have been the elevation that Bush needed to carry him into the election of 92. The problem that he's going to face is how, what it doesn't do for us. For instance, winning the war doesn't fix our economy back home. Coming out of Reagan's last term, the United States is going to go into a recession, and it's just growing over Bush's presidency. You're going to see a lot of companies start to downsize, so unemployment's going to go up. And what's going to happen is I mentioned this, it's going to come back to bite him, but he is going to go back on his promise, and he is actually going to raise taxes on the American people. And that's kind of going to be his doing in right there, is that while he did a great job with the Persian Gulf and all that, the economy back home was the focus of the American people, and that's always the case. I mean, we can have a whole lot of stuff going on in this country, but Americans, most of the time, their focus is on the economy. The other problem we're going to have that's going to have long-lasting effects for America is the fact that we are going to leave troops in the Middle East. And in doing so, we're doing that to, help secure the area so that, the Iraqis don't move back in. And we also put troops in Saudi Arabia and other places. That's going to anger a lot of Muslims in the area. They felt, they didn't want that Western influence. They didn't want America in the area. And that's going to give rise to future terrorists, such as the one sitting there on the left, Osama bin Laden. When we get to the election of 1992, it's going to be George Bush, and he's going to be running against Bill Clinton, the governor of Arkansas. But there's a wild card in this election, because we're going to have an independent candidate running who is going to run primarily on the economy, and his name is H. Ross Perot. Now, what's interesting about this election is Perot's influence is going to mimic what happened in the election of 1912. 1912, if you remember correctly, you had William Howard Taft, the Republican, and Woodrow Wilson going up against each other. However, the third-party candidate, Teddy Roosevelt, is going to enter the fray under the Progressive Party, or the Bull Moose Party. And what we'll see is Roosevelt will pull votes from the Republican candidate, and that's going to allow Wilson, the Democrat, to win that election. Well, the same thing is going to happen here. Perot is going to definitely pull votes away from Bush, and you can see with 43% of the popular vote, Clinton will win the presidency. What's interesting is when you look at this electoral map, what I want you to notice is the middle states, the Iowa, the Missouri, the Arkansas, the Louisiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia even. These are states that typically are red. And what the effect Perot had was he pulled enough votes away from Bush in those states that Clinton actually got the enough of the popular vote to get those electoral votes. So we're seeing a completely different political map. Now, Arkansas you can justify because obviously Clinton was the governor of Arkansas, so it makes sense that he would take that state. But when we look at Georgia or Louisiana or Tennessee and Kentucky, a lot of these states you're looking at that went blue that are typically red those are the states where the people were really hurting with the economics. So that's why this election was so important, is we see the effect that a strong third-party candidate can have. Going into the Clinton administration, one of his first big, foreign policy wins is going to be NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The purpose of this was just to open up the door of trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. We're removing all tariffs, any other restrictions, and it's going to, like it says there, encourage the international flow of goods and trades. What it's going to do, though, is it's going to allow a lot of American businesses to move down to Mexico for manufacturing. And so down the road, that's going to have an effect on our economy as well. The Brady Bill is going to pass under Clinton's administration. Now, James Brady had been the press secretary under Ronald Reagan, and was actually injured severely at the attempted assassination of Reagan. And this is going to lead to a push for gun control laws and stuff like that. And the Brady bill is going to pass, and what that will do is it's going to require a background check for anybody who wanted to buy a gun. And so that's one of the first laws that we've had with regards to gun control. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was passed during the Clinton administration. This was not seen as a victory for either side. Those who were against the homosexuals being in the military thought that this policy basically just swept everything under the rug. And quite honestly, those who supported gays in the military thought the exact same thing. It wasn't a sweeping victory for either side. 1994, we're going to see a shift in the Congress, in that Newt Gingrich is going to lead Republicans in what was called the Contract with America. And what Republicans promised to do was go to work trying to reduce taxes, reform welfare, and also create a balanced budget amendment. This is going to propel Republicans into a midterm election victory, in which for the first time in 40 years, Republicans will have control of the House of Representatives. Now, a lot of people will sit and say, well, that's going to make or create gridlock in Washington when you have an executive as a Democrat and the Congress is Republican. But in all honesty, what it really does is it forces both sides to work together. And that's what happened during this presidency and during this administration, is both sides found ways to work together. No one ever got everything they wanted, but progress was made in different areas. Clinton is probably best known for his scandals. There was a lot of talk about the extramarital affairs he had. Whitewater was an illegal land deal that he and his wife were accused of being part of. And with that accusation, he is going to be under the investigation of a special counsel. And when a special counsel is appointed to investigate a president, or anybody for that matter, they don't have to limit their investigation to one thing. So while Ken Starr, who was the special prosecutor, was investigating the real estate deals that were made by the Clintons and their friends, the McDougalls, other things started to come to the surface, and those things included the many affairs and sexual liaisons that Clinton had while both he was governor and president. There was one accusation of what was known as Troopergate, that Clinton has used his state troopers who served on his security detail in Arkansas to cover up or bring him women while he was president. But really, the most damning accusation is going to be when it comes out that Clinton had an affair with an intern at the White House, Monica Lewinsky. Now, the fact that he had an affair, while it's morally reprehensible, it's not illegal. What's going to be illegal is when he lies about it to a federal grand jury, because he will be called to testify, and in that testimony, he denies knowing her or having an affair with her, and he's going to be caught in the lie. And that's going to lead him to being impeached by the House of Representatives in 1988. Now, if you remember correctly, it's the House of Representatives who has the power to impeach a president. Once they impeach the president, it goes to the Senate for the trial. So impeachment does not equate to a president losing their seat. It basically says we're going to have a trial now. The Senate is going to conduct the trial for William Jefferson Clinton, and they are going to find that with regards to the perjury claim, they voted 55 to 45 that he was guilty, and obstruction of justice, it was a dead heat, 50 to 50. Well, in order to remove a person from office by the articles of impeachment, you have to have 2/3 of the votes of the Senate. And obviously you can see by those numbers that did not happen. Going into the 90s, we can look at some other things that happened within America. The one thing that was dealt with during the Clinton administration is going to be the Branch Davidians. They were a cult outside of Waco, Texas. They were accused of stockpiling weapons. There was accusations of sexual abuse with young girls. And due to the weapons charges, the ATF, under the authority of Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General under Clinton, They're going to raid their camp. And the Davidians, the Branch Davidians, were prepared, and a firefight's going to occur. And several ATF officers are going to be severely injured during this time and shot. That's going to lead to 51 days of negotiations between David Koresh and the FBI. Koresh is eventually just going to break off all communication, and what's going to end up happening is a fire is going to break out at the Davidian complex, and some people thought it was caused by smoke grenades that the FBI threw in. What we found afterwards is there was a lot of fuel, gas, and stuff like that that was dumped all over the complex. They set fire to the complex. It burned to the ground, and the people inside choosing to stay in there. And you could call it, Stockholm syndrome, or brainwashed because it was a cult. 76 people, including 20 children, are going to be killed in this. Now, this is going to upset a lot of people in America because we saw this unfold live on TV. It wasn't just a news story. We watched it live. And so you do have people upset. Now, not as upset as this guy, Timothy McVeigh, a Gulf War veteran, very upset with the federal government and how they handled the Branch Davidians and other things. He is actually going to build a bomb in the back of a rental truck, take it and park right in front of the federal office building in Oklahoma City. And on the second anniversary of the fire at the Branch Davidians, he is going to detonate that bomb, and you can see in that picture there the damage it does to that office building. With that homegrown terrorist activity, McVeigh is going to kill 168 people, including 19 children who were in a daycare center there at the federal office building. He's going to be found guilty of the bombing, and he will be put to death. Rodney King is going to be front and center in the headlines in L.A. The L.A. police pulled Rodney King over, and when he refused to comply with their orders, they beat him, and it was caught on a video recorder. And the five officers were put on trial for using excessive force. However, they are going to be acquitted. This is going to lead to the L.A. riots in 1992. People were upset that the police officers got off. They are upset that there was no justice for Rodney King. And the riots are going to go on for a week or so, and millions of dollars of damage is going to happen in L.A. The most notorious trial ever is going to be the O.J. Simpson murder trial. This takes place in 1995. Simpson accused of murdering his wife and her friend. It was a brutal murder, too. The trial is going to be carried on TV live every single day with a lot of theatrics, a lot of, theatrics. It was entertainment. Simpson will be acquitted for the crime, but just recently in the last year, there was a news interview he did where he basically described what he thought could have happened when his wife and her friend were murdered, and it's pretty apparent that he got away with murdering his wife. You can say that's my opinion, but I'm just going to stick to it. I think he did it. A lot of new technology came out in the 1990s. That's when we first got cell phones. Believe it or not, a lot of people lived without them for many, many years. They were first introduced really in the early 1990s, but you can see this graph shows by 2008 how much they had grown. And we have by 2000, over 400 million users, and that's even larger now. The web was introduced, the internet. We did not have the internet available publicly until the 1990s. And, www, World Wide Web, that got its start during this time period. Culture during the 90s, you can see the dress changed a little bit from the 80s. We got a little bit more grunge. Beanie Babies were very popular. TV shows that came out, The Simpsons got started in the 1990s, still on today. Friends, ER, and Seinfeld all premiered during the 1990s. That was Friends, Seinfeld, and ER were all part of that Thursday night lineup on NBC. And NBC had the corner of TV ratings throughout the 90s. And actually the 80s as well. Movies that came out, Titanic, Forrest Gump, Saving Private Ryan. These were the movies we were watching during this time. Music, Nirvana, Alanis Morissette, Metallica. We're kind of growing from what we had in the 80s. And then that's going to lead us to the election of 2000. It's almost like 1992 all over again, except this time you have someone in the picture of Ralph Nader there in the middle who's going to be pulling votes away from Al Gore, the Democratic nominee for president. And of course, George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, will be running for the Republican. Now, what's going to happen is that Florida, that 25 electoral votes is going to be in question. And whoever took Florida was going to win the presidency. And if you can look at this map here, this is voting by counties. And you can see there was a lot of dispersion throughout the country. There was, no clear winner really in most states, especially, east of the Mississippi. What's going to happen is Florida, there's going to be some voting irregularities with the ballot in Palm Beach City. And when we look at Palm Beach, basically the problem was the lineup of the names on the ballot. You had the Republican nominee on the left with the Democratic Al Gore on the right below him. But between those two, you had another third-party candidate, Pat Buchanan. And so a lot of people believe that's going to cause confusion to voters. Did they punch the right hole? Did they vote for the person they wanted to? This is going to lead to an examination of every single ballot in Palm Beach. Now, we didn't have electronic ballots. These were paper ballots that were read by a computer. So those little pieces of paper that got punched out were called chads. And the goal was, or what we're trying to do is understand what the intent of the voter was when we examined those chads. And we sat for weeks and watching the election officials absolutely break down or devour every single ballot that was cast to see if there was a possible mistake or what the intent of the voter actually looked like. In the end, what we're going to see is President Bush is going to have a lead in Palm Beach by 537 votes, which would give him Florida, the whole state of Florida. Now, Al Gore is still going to, and the Democratic Committee, they're going to sue, and this is going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. But the court finally says enough, and they say everything's been done that could be done, and they rule that Palm Beach and the rest of Florida had been certified to go to Bush as the winner, and that's going to stand. And so George W. Bush is going to become our 43rd president. All right, so that's it for the first two modern presidents that's going to be covered on the AP exam. You had George H.W. Bush and William Jefferson Clinton, and then the election of George W. Bush. Next slideshow will be covering George W. Bush as well as the Obama presidency. Have a great day.